You heard the line already. I'm going to send a great hospital boat to Greenland. It's such a simple sentence. Short, confident, declarative. And yet the moment you hear it, you pause. Wait, a hospital ship to Greenland? Why? That's where this story begins. Over the weekend, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that he was going to send what he described as a great hospital boat to Greenland. He framed it as humanitarian help people there. He suggested, "We're sick and not being taken care of." On the surface, it sounds generous. America helping. A big ship. Medical aid. Straightforward. But almost immediately, Greenland's leadership responded. And the response was not thank you. It was essentially no. Not hostile. Not dramatic. Just firm. They said they already have a free public healthcare system. They said their medical needs are being handled. And more importantly, they signaled something subtle but significant. Major decisions affecting Greenland should be discussed government to government, not announced unilaterally on social media. That response changes the tone of the entire story. Because now this isn't just about a hospital ship. It becomes about diplomacy. It becomes about messaging. It becomes about power, symbolism, and who gets to define the narrative. Let's slow this down. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own government. It manages its own domestic affairs, including healthcare. Denmark handles foreign policy and defense, but Greenland has increasing autonomy. So when a U.S. president publicly declares he's sending a hospital ship without coordination, it's not just logistics. It's political theater layered on a sovereign sensitivity. And here's something important. Greenland didn't ask for help. That matters. When assistance is requested, it's partnership. When it's announced without request, it can feel like projection. And projection, in international politics, is never neutral. Now, let's talk about the hospital ships themselves for a moment. The United States does operate large medical vessels Ussen's Mercy and Ussen's Comfort. They are real assets. They've been deployed for humanitarian missions, disaster relief, and pandemic response. But they're not taxi cabs. They require planning, readiness, staffing, logistics, command structures. Reports indicated neither ship appeared positioned for immediate deployment. That doesn't mean deployment is impossible. It means it's not casual. So when a statement like this appears online, there's a credibility question that follows it. Is this a fully formed operational directive, or is it a symbolic announcement designed to communicate intent? And that distinction matters politically, because even if the ship never sails, the headline already traveled. Let's shift the lens slightly. Why Greenland? Greenland has been a recurring topic in Trump's political orbit for years. There's long-standing U.S. strategic interest in the Arctic shipping routes, rare earth minerals, military positioning, radar systems, geographic advantage. Keeping Greenland in the conversation isn't random. When you say Greenland in a presidential context, you activate a strategic map in the minds of policymakers. Now layer this over the method of communication. Truth Social. Not a diplomatic cable. Not a State Department briefing. Not a joint statement. A direct-to-public announcement. That approach does something very specific. It forces reaction. When you post publicly, you compress response time. You put the other government in a position where silence looks like agreement. So Greenland had to respond. And their response became part of the story. This is a pattern we've seen before in modern political communication, not just with Trump, but particularly amplified in his style. Announcement first, negotiation later. Headline first, clarification after. Now, let's talk about domestic optics. Back home in the U.S., the phrase hospital ship carries emotional weight. It implies compassion. It implies capacity. It implies America can mobilize resources at scale. It's difficult to criticize the idea of helping people without sounding cynical. So from a messaging standpoint, it's relatively safe terrain. If critics say it's unnecessary, the counter-narrative becomes, why oppose helping? If critics say it's unrealistic, the counter becomes, why block decisive action? It's strategically framed. But international politics isn't just domestic optics. Greenland's leadership didn't escalate rhetorically. They didn't attack. They simply said they have universal health care. They're handling it, and decisions should be discussed formally. That calm rejection is powerful, because it reframes the narrative from U.S. offers help to Greenland asserts sovereignty, and sovereignty messaging resonates strongly in smaller nations. Now let's think about Denmark for a moment. Denmark supports Greenland economically and administratively. Any U.S. action there intersects with Danish foreign policy. When Greenland says no publicly, Denmark notices, allies notice, even if the issue seems small, the symbolism is not. Here's where things get interesting. In politics, sometimes the proposal itself isn't the objective. Sometimes the reaction is. By making a bold humanitarian announcement tied to Greenland, Trump ensures that Greenland leadership must publicly articulate their independence and healthcare strength. That response then becomes part of the geopolitical record. It reinforces Greenland's self-image as capable and autonomous. And it keeps Arctic strategy in headlines without legislation, without congressional votes, without formal policy rollout. Now let's zoom out even further. There are three possible trajectories from here. First, this fades. It becomes a short news cycle story, a social media announcement, a polite rejection, and everyone moves on. Second, it evolves. Maybe there's follow-up clarification from U.S. officials. Maybe it becomes framed as an offer of assistance. Maybe it shifts into a broader conversation about Arctic cooperation. Third, and this is subtle, it becomes groundwork. Sometimes symbolic gestures lay narrative infrastructure for future policy shifts. Not automatically, not inevitably, but rhetorically. If you normalize the idea that the U.S. is deeply involved in Greenland's well-being, you expand the conceptual space for future engagement. That doesn't mean expansion is planned. It means the rhetorical door is open. And here's the thing about political communication in 2026. It moves faster than policy, but policy often trails narrative. The narrative environment matters. Let me pause here. If you're watching this and thinking, isn't this overanalyzing a social media post? That's fair. But in high-level politics, even small statements from major figures ripple outward. A hospital ship comment triggers headlines in AP, Reuters, Vox, Washington Post. That's not small. And notice something else. The language Trump used, great hospital boat. It's conversational. It's not bureaucratic. It's not technical. It's branding language. That phrasing makes the image accessible. Big, white ship, doctors, help. It's easy to visualize. And visualization is powerful in politics. Now let's talk about credibility. If the ships aren't actually being mobilized, critics can argue it was symbolic. If they are mobilized, it becomes operational policy. So there's a built-in pressure test. And that pressure test is time-bound. The next 72 hours determine whether this remains rhetorical or transitions to formal planning. Watch for Pentagon briefings. Watch for State Department language. Watch for whether Denmark is formally engaged. Those signals will tell you if this was messaging or movement. Here's another layer. Greenland's response emphasized their free healthcare system. That creates an interesting contrast narrative domestically in the U.S., where healthcare is politically contentious. The international comparison dynamic is subtle but present, and that contrast can spark additional media debate. But again, Greenland's tone wasn't confrontational. It was measured, which actually neutralizes escalation. Measured diplomacy often de-escalates bold rhetoric. And that's what we're seeing. So what does this ultimately reveal? It reveals a communication style that prioritizes initiative signaling. It reveals sensitivity in small nations regarding sovereignty. It reveals how humanitarian framing intersects with geopolitical interest. And it shows how one sentence can generate multi-layered response across continents. Now, stepping back and speaking more candidly, this is modern political strategy. Short, declarative announcements that create optionality. Optionality is key. If it works, you lean in. If it doesn't, you pivot. And because it was framed as humanitarian, the reputational downside is relatively contained. That's not accidental. That's calculated messaging. None of this requires outrage. None of this requires exaggeration. It's simply political chess played in public view. And the interesting part, we're all watching the board. Whether you view this as bold leadership or symbolic posturing depends largely on your broader view of Trump's style. But the mechanics are visible. Announcement, reaction, diplomatic correction, media amplification, strategic ambiguity. That's the cycle. And it happened in less than 48 hours. So where does this leave us? For now, it leaves us with a headline, a rejection, and a strategic question mark. Will there be follow-up? Will this escalate into formal discussions? Or will it simply remain a reminder that in today's politics, even a hospital boat can carry geopolitical weight? That's what we're watching next. And if you're tracking Arctic politics, US-Denmark relations, or Trump's communication style heading into the next cycle, this moment, small as it seems, fits into a much larger pattern. Not explosive, not dramatic, but instructive. Very instructive. If you'd like, I can continue and deepen the analysis further into Arctic strategic positioning, historical context of U.S.-Greenland interest, and how messaging-first diplomacy reshapes alliance behavior while still preserving the exact facts of this event. Because if we stop at Trump suggested a hospital ship and Greenland said no, we miss the deeper pattern. And this isn't about exaggerating the moment. It's about understanding how these moments fit into something bigger. So take a breath with me and zoom out. Greenland is not just a remote Arctic territory most Americans rarely think about. Strategically, it sits in one of the most important geographic corridors on the planet. The Arctic is opening slowly, unevenly but opening. Shipping routes shift, ice patterns change, resource discussions intensify, military planners map it constantly. Now, none of that changed because of one Truth Social post. But here's what did happen. The word Greenland re-entered mainstream political headlines in the United States and across Europe again. That repetition matters. In geopolitics, repetition builds normalization. The more often a region is publicly discussed by major leaders, the more psychologically embedded it becomes in public discourse. And when something becomes embedded in discourse, policy conversation feels less abrupt later. It feels familiar, and familiarity lowers resistance. Now, I'm not suggesting there's a hidden master plan behind every social media sentence. That would be overreach. But I am saying political communication often works in layers. The first layer is literal. I'm going to send a hospital boat. The second layer is symbolic. America is present. America is capable. America is watching. The third layer is strategic positioning. We are invested in this region. And then there's the reaction layer. Greenland responds. Denmark watches. European media reports. US outlets amplify. Analysts interpret. And suddenly what looked like a single post becomes a diplomatic event. Let's talk tone for a moment. Greenland didn't overreact. They didn't escalate rhetorically. They didn't accuse. They didn't attack. They simply said, essentially, we have a functioning healthcare system. We didn't request this. Please coordinate through official channels. That's a smart move. Why? Because calm firmness often projects confidence more effectively than anger. If they had lashed out, it could have escalated. Instead, they asserted sovereignty without drama. That's controlled diplomacy. And it matters because it avoids giving the original statement additional fuel. Now, domestically in the US, the reaction plays differently. Supporters might view this as proactive leadership offering assistance, thinking globally, showing initiative. Critics might view it as impulsive, making international declarations without groundwork. Both interpretations can exist simultaneously. That's the nature of modern political polarization. But here's something more neutral and structural. The method of communication bypassed traditional diplomatic sequencing. Normally, governments explore ideas quietly before public announcements. Conversations happen behind closed doors. Signals are tested. Reactions are gauged privately. This did the opposite. Public first, process second. And that inversion is central to understanding Trump's communication style more broadly. It compresses time. It reduces the gap between thought and headline. It forces institutions to react instead of pre-negotiate. Sometimes that creates leverage. Sometimes it creates friction. Often, it creates both. Now let's consider logistics again, not in a technical way. Just conceptually, hospital ships are complex assets. They require crew mobilization, medical staffing, coordination with port authorities, infrastructure alignment, weather assessment, international clearance. None of that happens overnight. So when the idea is announced without those visible steps, observers immediately ask, is this an actual deployment plan or a signal? And signals are powerful tools. Signals can test international response. Signals can gauge domestic reaction. Signals can remind audiences of capability without actually deploying it. In some cases, the signal itself accomplishes the political objective. Think about that. If the goal is to remind the world that the United States has floating hospitals that can project humanitarian capacity anywhere, mission accomplished. No ship needs to move. If the goal is to keep Greenland in conversation, mission accomplished. If the goal is to reinforce an image of decisive leadership, the sentence alone attempts that. Now let's pivot to something subtle. Greenland emphasized that they have free universal healthcare. That line carries weight. It introduces a comparative undertone into the conversation, even if unintentionally. Because whenever healthcare systems are mentioned internationally, domestic comparisons are triggered in the American audience. Again, no dramatic conclusions here, just recognizing the narrative ripple. And then there's Denmark. Denmark's role is quieter but structurally important. As the sovereign state responsible for foreign affairs, Denmark must manage the diplomatic lane. If the US were to formally engage Greenland, it would likely flow through Danish channels. So when Greenland says please coordinate officially, that's not just about courtesy. It's about process integrity. International law and diplomatic protocol are built on sequencing. Public announcements that skip sequence can be seen as disruptive even if framed positively. Now let's slow down again. Because this is where some viewers might ask, does any of this actually change anything? Maybe not immediately. There's no treaty here. No bill signed. No troop movement. No funding allocation. But political influence isn't always about immediate action. It's about shaping perception. And perception shapes future space for action. If U.S. audiences become accustomed to hearing about Greenland as strategically relevant, that mental shift matters over time. If European audiences become accustomed to responding publicly to U.S. overtures, that shapes diplomatic tone. If Greenland reinforces its autonomy publicly, that strengthens its internal political identity. All of that unfolds from one sentence. That's not overstatement. That's just how interconnected communication is at this level. Now let's talk about something even more subtle: optional escalation. When a bold statement is made and rejected calmly, the originator has choices. Double down, clarify, pivot, or let it fade. Each option sends a different signal. If there's doubling down, that indicates a willingness to test boundaries. If there's clarification, that suggests recalibration. If it fades, it suggests the objective was already met at the messaging level. And right now, we're in that waiting phase. The next public move matters more than the first one, because the second move reveals intention. Now I want to shift tones slightly, not dramatically, just analytically. There's a broader question here about modern leadership styles in the digital age. When leaders communicate directly to the public without intermediary institutions, it accelerates cycles, but it also decentralizes authority. Traditional diplomatic structures exist to filter, refine, and align messaging before it becomes global. Direct posting removes that buffer. Sometimes that creates clarity. Sometimes it creates turbulence. In this case, it created immediate global reporting. AP covered it. Reuters covered it. Vox covered it. Washington Post covered it. That amplification wasn't because of military movement. It was because of message novelty and international response. That tells you something about the media environment. Novelty plus diplomatic tension equals coverage. Now, I want to be careful here. There's no evidence of operational deployment underway at this moment. There's no evidence of formal bilateral negotiation triggered by this specific statement. So we're not projecting outcomes. We're observing reaction patterns. That's important, because in political analysis, it's easy to overreach. The disciplined approach is to track signals without inventing consequences. And the signal here is clear. A humanitarian gesture was publicly proposed. The recipient government publicly declined. Diplomatic protocol was emphasized. Media amplified. The U.S. has not yet escalated or formalized beyond the initial statement. That's the board as it stands. Now let's talk psychology for a second. In politics, bold gestures, even symbolic ones, create a sense of momentum. Momentum is an intangible but powerful force in narrative building. When leaders appear to act decisively, even in announcement form, it can reinforce a perception of activity and initiative. That perception matters in domestic political cycles. It signals leadership energy, but leadership energy must eventually align with institutional mechanics to sustain credibility. If bold announcements repeatedly don't translate into structural follow-through, skepticism grows. If they occasionally do translate, unpredictability becomes leverage. And unpredictability, used strategically, can shift negotiation dynamics. Now, am I saying this hospital ship proposal is a negotiation tactic? No. I'm saying unpredictability as a communication style shapes international perception over time. Allies adapt. Adversaries adapt. Media adapts. And adaptation influences future interactions. Greenland's measured response suggests adaptation. They didn't panic. They didn't overreact. They calmly reasserted autonomy. That's strategic maturity. Now, here's something else worth noting. This entire episode unfolded without military framing. It was humanitarian framing. That's significant. Humanitarian language reduces tension. It lowers defensive posture. It frames involvement as benevolent. That's much easier to introduce into public discourse than hard power rhetoric. Soft power signaling is often underestimated. A hospital ship isn't a warship, but it's still projection. Projection of medical capacity, projection of logistical reach, projection of capability, and projection is inherently geopolitical, even if wrapped in compassion. Now let's address something plainly. Some viewers might ask, is this performative? That depends on definition. If performative means symbolic communication intended to shape perception, then most political communication is performative to some degree. If performative means insincere, there's no evidence of that here. Intent can't be measured purely from phrasing. We evaluate based on follow-through. And follow-through is still pending. So where does that leave us? It leaves us watching. Watching for institutional signals. Watching for diplomatic clarification. Watching for escalation or fade-out. But regardless of outcome, this moment illustrates something broader about how international politics now unfolds in real time. A post becomes a headline becomes a diplomatic statement becomes analysis, and analysis becomes part of the strategic environment. We are inside that environment right now, and that's why even something as seemingly unusual as a great hospital boat to Greenland deserves careful, calm examination, not outrage, not dismissal, examination, because strategy often hides in plain sight, not in secrecy, but in framing. And framing shapes futures. So here's the grounded takeaway. This wasn't a crisis. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a military maneuver. It was a statement. But statements at that level are rarely random. They serve messaging purposes. They test reactions. They reinforce themes. And they create optional next steps. Greenland's response reinforced sovereignty. Trump's statement reinforced initiative. The media reinforced attention. And now we wait to see which direction the next move comes from. That's where this stands. No drama required. Just observation. And sometimes, in politics, observation is the most powerful tool we have.